Everyone knows the 10 plagues. Almost no one knows. 9 of them were aimed at Egyptian gods, and the 10th wasn't aimed at a god at all. The sun comes up over the Nile the way it has for 3,000 years before this morning gold first. Then white, then unbearable. A young priest named Hor stands on the riverbank with a clay bowl in his hands, ready for the morning ritual. Behind him, the temple bells are already ringing for the first prayers of the day. He doesn't know yet that his god is about to die in front of him. Hold that thought. We'll come back to Hor. 40 years earlier, a man named Moses ran from this exact palace with blood on his hands and a death sentence on his head. He was a prince once raised in these halls, fed at this table, trained by these priests. Then he killed an Egyptian overseer and disappeared into the desert, where he spent 4 decades doing the one job no Egyptian prince was ever supposed to do: herding sheep for his father-in-law in the middle of nowhere, under a sky with no temples in it at all. Now he is 80 years old, and he is walking back through the front gate. Beside him is his brother Aaron, older, steadier, the one who actually knows how to talk to people. Moses stutters. Moses argues with God in the desert for chapters before he agrees to come back at all. This is not a confident hero walking into a throne room. This is a frightened old shepherd, carrying a staff, standing in front of the most powerful man alive, about to say 6 words that will end an empire's certainty about itself. Let my people go. Pharaoh laughs. Of course he does. To Pharaoh, this is not a negotiation between 2 rulers. This is, in his own theology, a contest between gods. Pharaoh is not just a king, he is considered the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, and a guarantor of Ra, the sun. The Nile itself is divine, the source of all life in a land that gets almost no rain. Frogs, cattle, the sky, the sun, even the darkness, every single one of them has a name. A face, a temple, a calendar of festivals built around keeping it happy. Egypt is not a country with some gods in it. Egypt is a country built entirely out of gods, stacked on top of each other, holding the whole structure up, which is exactly why what happens next is not a magic trick. It's a war. The Hebrew word the text uses for what's coming is makkah, not trouble, not disaster. It means a blow, a strike, something aimed, and the first blow is aimed at the holiest thing in Egypt. Moses raises his staff over the river and the Nile, the artery of the entire civilization. The body of the god Hapi himself turns to blood, not red water. Blood. Fish die by the thousands and rot in the heat. The smell rolls across the whole delta into the markets, into the palace kitchens, into the lungs of everyone who breathes that morning. And Hor, the young priest from the riverbank, watches the water he poured out as an offering that morning curdle into something his god was never supposed to become. Dead and rotting in front of his own temple steps. Here's what most people miss. The Egyptian court magicians, 2 men named in later tradition as Jannes and Jambres, actually copy the trick. They turn water to blood too, somewhere else along the river. Pharaoh feels validated. See? Our gods can do this also. He goes back to his palace and doesn't even discuss it at dinner. 7 days pass. The river stays red. Nothing changes, but it gets stranger. The second blow comes for Heket, the frog-headed goddess of fertility and birth supposed to guard new life. Pregnant mothers, the safety of every newborn in Egypt. Now her sacred animal pours out of the dying river by the millions, into bedrooms, into bread ovens, into the kneading bowls where Egyptian women make the next day's food. The thing that was supposed to protect their homes is now suffocating them in their own kitchens, croaking under their beds at night. Pharaoh actually breaks first. This time he calls for Moses, begs him to pray the frogs away, promises to let the people go. The frogs die in heaps the next morning, rotting in piles in every street in Egypt, scraped into mounds outside every door. And the moment the smell clears, so does Pharaoh's promise. Third blow. Dust turns to gnats, swarming everywhere. Even the priests cannot perform their purification rituals because they cannot stay clean for 5 minutes at a time. And in Egyptian religion, an unclean priest cannot approach a god at all. This time the magicians try to copy it, and they can't. For the first time, they say something to Pharaoh that he does not want to hear. This is the finger of a god, not their explanation, not a trick. Something real, something bigger than their tricks can reach. Pay attention to this. Pharaoh doesn't listen to his own magicians. Fourth blow, flies, but this time something shifts in the text itself. God draws a line. The land of Goshen, where the Hebrew slaves live, stays untouched. Every other patch of Egyptian ground is covered in swarming flies. Goshen is clean, sealed off like a different country entirely. For the first time, the Egyptians are forced to watch a line being drawn between who is being judged and who is being spared. And they cannot explain it, and they cannot cross it, no matter how far they walk along the border. Pharaoh negotiates again. Sacrifice to your God here, inside Egypt, he says. Moses refuses. The Hebrew sacrifices would be an insult to Egyptian gods, performed on their own soil. Pharaoh almost lets them go, then pulls back at the last second, the way a man does when he's already decided what he's afraid to admit out loud. 4 gods down, 4 exits offered. 4 times the door closes again. But there's a number sitting underneath all of this that nobody in the palace wants to ask out loud. Why 10? Why not 3? Why not show up with overwhelming force on day 1 and end it? We'll come back to that question. It matters more than anyone in this story understands yet. Here's the part most people never reach. The first 4 plagues hit Egypt's gods of nature, the river, the soil, the sky. The next 5 are going to hit something much closer to home. Egyptian bodies, Egyptian wealth, and finally, the sun god himself, in his own sky at noon. If this story is landing for you so far, stay with me, because what comes next is the part that turns this from a list of disasters into the most precise legal indictment in the ancient world. Pharaoh is about to lose his cattle, his skin, his crops, his sky, and his sun, in that order. And he is going to choose every single loss himself. 5th blow. A plague kills the livestock, the cattle sacred to Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of love and motherhood, and to Apis, the living bull god kept in his own temple, fed by his own priests, bathed daily, worshipped as a god walking on 4 legs in the middle of the capital. Every animal in Egyptian fields dies in a single day. Not one animal belonging to the Hebrews in Goshen so much as gets sick. Here's what most people miss about this one Apis. The bull was supposed to be immortal in spirit, reincarnated endlessly from one sacred calf to the next, a god who could not simply die in a field like ordinary livestock, and that's exactly what happens to him in the open, where everyone can see it. 6th blow. Ash from a furnace thrown into the air becomes boils breaking out on the skin of every Egyptian, including, the text says specifically, on the magicians themselves. Jannes and Jambres, the men who once copied Moses' miracles, the men who once stood next to Pharaoh as proof his gods were equal to this. Now they cannot even stand in front of him without wincing. They are covered in sores, the same as the lowest servant in the kitchens. The contest is over, though nobody in the palace says so out loud yet. Stay with me, because the 7th blow is where the warnings stop being polite. A hailstorm falls on Egypt mixed with fire flame inside ice, something that should not exist by any law Egypt understood, destroying crops, trees, animals left out in the field. Anything not brought inside before the sky turned black. This time Moses gives an actual warning beforehand. Bring your people and animals under shelter, or they will die where they stand. Some Egyptians listen and survive, some don't, and lose everything in an hour. For the first time in this story, an Egyptian's fate depends not on which god he serves, but on whether he believes the warning at all. Pharaoh, again, breaks "I have sinned," he says, the first time those words leave his mouth in this entire story, and the moment the hail stops, so does the confession. 8th blow. Locusts cover what the hail left standing, stripping every green thing out of Egypt down to bare ground in a single afternoon, a strike at Senihem. The locust-headed protector god who was supposed to guard the harvest from exactly this kind of devastation. Pharaoh's own officials turn on him now, in his own throne room. Do you not yet realize Egypt is ruined? They ask him, point blank to his face. In front of the court, he almost listens. Almost. If you've made it this far, stay with me, because what comes next isn't a disaster against a god of nature, or wealth, or harvest. What comes next is aimed straight at the sky. 9th blow. Darkness falls over Egypt for 3 days, not night, not an eclipse, a darkness the text says could be felt. Thick enough that no one leaves their house, no one lights a lamp that stays lit, and this one is aimed directly at Ra, the sun god, the highest deity in the entire Egyptian pantheon. The god Pharaoh himself is supposed to embody on earth as his living representative. For 3 days, the most powerful god in Egypt cannot make the sun rise, and in Goshen, a few miles away, every single Hebrew home has light. 9 gods, 9 strikes, 9 times the door opened, and 9 times Pharaoh closed it himself, with his own hand every single time. Pharaoh tells Moses, in the dark, never to come back to his face again or he will die. Moses agrees. There is one more blow coming, and this time it isn't aimed at a god at all. Here's the part nobody tells you about the 10th plague. It doesn't have a target's name carved on a temple wall anywhere in Egypt, because it isn't aimed at a god. It's aimed at every firstborn son in the land, from the son of Pharaoh sitting on the throne, to the son of the lowest servant grinding grain behind a mill, to the firstborn of the cattle still standing in the field. This is where we go back to Hor. Remember him, the young priest standing by the river on the very first morning, watching his god turn to blood. Hor has a son, a firstborn son, maybe 6 years old, maybe 7, the kind of age where a boy still falls asleep against his father's chest after a long day at the temple. For 9 plagues, Hor has watched his gods fail, one after another, the river, the frogs, the cattle, the sun itself, swallowed in darkness for 3 days while his own prayers changed nothing. And now Moses tells the Hebrews something the Egyptians are never told directly at all. Take a lamb, without defect, and kill it. Put its blood on the doorframe of your house. Tonight, something is coming through Egypt at midnight, and the blood on the door is the only thing standing between your house and what's coming. This is Pesach, Passover. The Hebrew word means simply to pass over, not to skip, not to ignore. To pass over the way you step over something already paid for, already covered, already settled in advance, inside the houses marked with blood. Families eat standing up, sandals on, ready to leave before dawn, the meat still hot on the fire. Outside those houses, all across Egypt, nothing is marked, nothing is covered. And at midnight, the text says, "There is not a house in Egypt without someone dead in it." Picture a mother in the dark, in a country she has never doubted protects her, sitting beside her son's bed because something in the air feels wrong tonight. Though she cannot say what, she doesn't know about a doorframe in a slave quarter across the city, with lamb's blood on it. She only knows the silence in the house has changed shape. Every parent who has ever sat in the dark, listening for a sound their child isn't making anymore, understands the particular shape of that silence. It is the oldest fear a parent carries. And on this one night, in this one country, it lands on every house that isn't covered by blood already given. Pharaoh's own son is one of them. The man who is supposed to be the living face of Ra on earth, the man who watched 9 of his gods fail one by one and still would not bend, loses. The one thing power was never supposed to be able to lose. And this time there is no negotiation left to offer, because the thing he refused to give up freely has just been taken from him completely, in his own house, in the same dark hour that took every other house in Egypt. That night, Pharaoh sends for Moses himself, not a messenger, himself at midnight, with his son's body still in the palace behind him, and he says the 6 words that 40 years of running, and 10 plagues and 9 dead gods finally bought. Go, serve the Lord, as you have said. The empire built out of gods could not protect the one thing every parent in it actually loved. 3 things to carry out of this. First, these 10 plagues were never random disasters. They were a list, aimed one by one at the actual gods Egypt trusted to keep it safe. The river, the harvest, the cattle, the sun itself. Every single one failed in order, in public, where the entire nation could watch it happen. Second, Pharaoh wasn't defeated by force. He was given 9 separate doors out, and he closed every one of them himself. The judgment didn't take away his choice. It just kept revealing what he'd already chosen over and over until there was nothing left to reveal. And third, the only thing that ever protected anyone on that final night wasn't status, wasn't power, wasn't which god's temple you served in. It was blood on a door, applied in advance, before the danger ever arrived. Hor lost his son that night, a Hebrew slave with nothing, no temple, no title, no god with a name carved in stone did not, because of something painted on a doorframe hours before he needed it. Which plague in this story hit you the hardest, the gods falling one by one, or the silence in the houses on that last night? Tell me below.